Every solar day, 1,000 people are fed into the Golden Throne. That number comes from the original Warhammer 40,000 rulebook, the first edition, published in 1987, known as Rogue Trader, and it has held consistent across every subsequent edition since. 1,000 psykers, human beings born with an innate connection to a parallel dimension of raw psychic energy called the warp, their abilities ranging from faint empathic sensitivity to outright reality alteration. They are simultaneously indispensable to the civilization that produces them and feared by it in almost equal measure. And 1,000 of them, every solar day, for 10,000 years, have been fed into a machine to keep one man's soul tethered to the physical universe. Do the math. 1,000 per day, 365 days a year, 10,000 years. That is 3.65 billion people, more than the current combined population of Europe and North America, delivered to a single piece of machinery, all of it spent to sustain one individual who hasn't spoken, moved, or given any recognizable sign of consciousness for any of those 10 millennia. The number in that title is a floor. By 989.m36, roughly 5,000 years into the Emperor's vigil, 4,000 years before the game's main timeline, the sacrifice rate had already quadrupled from the original baseline. The documented fourfold escalation means the real cumulative total is substantially larger than 3.6 billion, and the machine is still failing. Three paradoxes hold this situation in place. An immortal who can't die completely enough to escape his own life support. A civilization fighting wars with technology its own ancestors built, then forgot, then made it heresy to understand. And a throne that has consumed billions and still can't hold. Each paradox opens a door into how the Imperium actually functions. Not the origin story, not the ancient history, but the mechanism. The mechanism is grimmer, and grimmer is more accurate. The Golden Throne sits beneath the Imperial Palace on Terra, Earth, rebuilt past any recognition across 100,000 years of layered architecture, the original surface buried under kilometers of accumulated civilization until it exists only as geological sediment. The Emperor has occupied it for approximately 10,000 years. The standard Warhammer 40,000 rulebook, in its first edition and every subsequent one, describes him in this state as a rotting carcass writhing invisibly with power from the dark age of technology. That is the official opening description of the most important figure in the setting's entire cosmology. It isn't the description of a plan that came together. The throne wasn't built to sustain a dying man. This distinction is the load-bearing fact of the entire situation. The Emperor constructed it as the interface device for the Webway project. The Webway is a network of interdimensional tunnels engineered by the Eldar, the alien civilization that predated humanity's stellar expansion by millions of years, connecting points in real space through its own dimensional substrate, entirely bypassing the warp. Standard interstellar travel in the 41st millennium requires entering the warp directly, that parallel dimension of raw psychic energy ungoverned by any physical laws recognizable to conventional physics, populated by four immense entities. The Chaos Gods, psychic personifications of excess, decay, change, and violence, who treat the passage of a human fleet through their dimension as something between a navigational intrusion and a feeding opportunity. Every warp transit is a negotiated risk. Ships navigate by beacon, by the perceptual gifts of their navigator, and by the institutional understanding that the dimension they're crossing is actively hostile to their presence. Temporal displacement, collective psychological collapse, demonic intrusion. These are the known failure modes, the ones documented in operational doctrine. The unknown ones are why the doctrine keeps expanding. The Webway project was meant to end all of that. A transit infrastructure operating entirely outside warp space, connecting the Imperium's million worlds through safe corridors that bypassed psychic exposure entirely. Over time, it would have dramatically reduced the structural leverage the Chaos Gods held over human civilization, replaced the warp routes every fleet depended on, and given the Imperium a navigational foundation that didn't require feeding a continuous supply of human souls to maintain. The project's strategic implications extended further than simple travel efficiency. An Imperium that didn't require constant warp exposure would have fundamentally different relationships with chaos, with its navigators, and with the psychic cost of maintaining interstellar civilization. The Emperor worked on it in secret, on Terra, for years. That secrecy cost him something immediate. It required him to remain physically present at the project's location, rather than commanding the great crusade he had launched to reunite scattered human worlds. He delegated field authority to his Primarchs, genetically engineered sons, the superhuman commanders of the Space Marine legions, and granted supreme command to the War Master Horus, his most capable general and most trusted son. The delegation that made the Webway project possible also made the Horus heresy possible. But the heresy is background. What matters here is what happened to the project itself. A Primarch named Magnus the Red destroyed it in a single moment. Magnus led the Thousand Suns Space Marine Legion, a force of psychically gifted warriors operating under an explicit prohibition on unsanctioned psychic use. A prohibition that existed specifically because of Magnus's own documented history with uncontrolled applications of his power. He was brilliant, reckless with that brilliance, and genuinely loyal to the Emperor in a way that made his catastrophic decisions tragic rather than malicious. When he discovered that Horus had been corrupted by the Chaos Gods and was moving toward open rebellion, the warning was urgent and the conventional channels were closed. Magnus made his calculation. He forced a psychic transmission directly to the Emperor on Terra, channeling his full power through warp space to deliver it. The transmission arrived. The warning was accurate. What the transmission also did was detonate every psychic ward the Emperor had placed around the Webway gate, the physical breach point built directly into the Golden Throne structure, and demons poured through the opening into the tunnel network running beneath the Imperial Palace. Terra, the most secure location in the Imperium, was now running an active demonic incursion through its own foundations, spreading through Webway tunnels branching under the entire surface of the planet. The Emperor made the choice that ended his freedom permanently. He abandoned the Webway project, took his seat on the throne, not to power a revolution in interstellar travel, but to hold the breach closed with his body and his mind, and delegated supreme military command to Horus. Horus was already lost. The Horus heresy split the Space Marine legions across a decade of catastrophic civil war and ended with Horus's fleet besieging Terra itself. The Emperor left the throne once more to confront his former war master in direct personal combat. The wounds Horus inflicted were beyond any possibility of recovery. The Emperor destroyed Horus, but the cost was absolute. A body that would never function again, a consciousness that would never speak again, a physical existence that would require constant mechanical and psychic support from that moment forward. In the Emperor's absence from the throne during that confrontation, his closest advisor held it. Malcador the Sigillite was extraordinary by any measure, a figure who, in some accounts, claimed to be over 6,700 years old at the time of the heresy, with psychic abilities approaching the upper limit of what human biology can sustain. His age alone places him in a category of being so unusual that normal human lifespans become almost irrelevant as comparison. Malcador sat on the Golden Throne for the duration of the Emperor's engagement with Horus. It consumed him in a matter of hours, not days, not a gradual deterioration measured across weeks. Hours. A 6,700-year-old psychic of near incomprehensible ability, reduced to nothing by a machine he had not been built to operate. That is the baseline. That is what the Emperor sustains every solar day, held together only by the continuous flow of psyker souls the black ships bring to his doorstep. When the surviving Primarch, Rogel Dorn, carried what remained of the Emperor back from that final battle, the injuries were beyond any known treatment. The canonical account has the emperor himself acknowledging that his body would never heal, that he would never walk among his people again, that the machine would hold him permanently. He was placed on the same throne that had just destroyed Malcador. The Webway project never resumed. The breach under Terra never fully sealed. The machine built to liberate humanity from warp dependency became the permanent prison of the one being whose presence holds the entire civilization together. The 1,000 psykers per day don't arrive on Terra by accident. Their presence is the end result of a logistical infrastructure spanning roughly 1 million inhabited worlds, maintained for 10,000 years, organized entirely around one purpose: keeping the supply of souls flowing without interruption. The organization responsible is the Adeptus Astra Telepathica. On any given world across the Imperium's reach, people born with psychic abilities are identified through whatever mechanism the local authority employs: registration systems on developed worlds, denunciation on more primitive ones, the Astra Telepathica's own assessment teams on scheduled visits. Psykers appear in every human population with rough statistical regularity. The warp doesn't discriminate by geography, social class, or political convenience. A miner's child at the edge of the galaxy is as likely to develop psychic sensitivity as the daughter of a planetary governor on a core world. The ability appears regardless of context, which means the collection apparatus must reach everywhere, because everywhere produces what the throne requires. The black ships are the collection vessels. Each is a void-capable warship operated by the Adeptus Astra Telepathica, armored and armed not as a fighting vessel primarily, but as a containment hull, built to move populations of psychically active individuals across interstellar distances without the incidental consequences that unshielded psykers in close proximity tend to produce in the warp. The fleet traces a continuous circuit through Imperium space, arriving at worlds in sequences determined by tithe schedules maintained across centuries. When a black ship arrives at a world, its mandate is simple and non-negotiable: collect the psyker tithe and depart. A world's debt to the throne isn't subject to appeal. A planet experiencing an epidemic when the black ship arrives still owes its tithe. A colony rebuilding from bombardment still produces what the schedule demands. Local governors who have built their own relationships with the psykers on their worlds, using them as administrators, communicators, military assets, can't retain them when the schedule calls for collection. The throne's need supersedes whatever individual utility a world has found for its psychic population. The black ships don't negotiate this. The transit time between collection and delivery isn't trivial. A black ship crossing warp space from the outer edges of the Imperium toward Terra can spend months in the warp alone, and the collection circuit between departure from Terra and return can span years as the vessel works through its assigned systems. The psykers loaded into those holds live that transit. They aren't sedated for convenience. They know, in the way that people aboard condemned transports have always known, where the journey ends. Some were reported to authorities by their own families. Some turned themselves in voluntarily rather than face the alternative: uncontrolled psychic expression in an Imperium that treats unregistered psykers as one of its more serious hazards. The holds are shielded, monitored, and secured. The passengers are processed, categorized, and delivered. When a black ship docks at Terra, the offloading feeds into the Scholastica Psychana, the processing infrastructure of the Adeptus Astra Telepathica on the throne world itself. From there, psykers enter the apparatus surrounding the Golden Throne. The mechanics of consumption aren't theatrical. 1,000 psykers burning through per day isn't 1,000 simultaneous ritual executions on a schedule. The throne houses, at any given time, approximately 10,000 psykers in active processing, with the documented 1,000 burning through per solar day at the baseline rate. Souls consumed at predictable intervals as the machine draws from each one until what it needs is exhausted, and what remains isn't a person in any functional sense. The pool is continuously replenished because it's continuously emptied. And there is a second, larger demand running in parallel that the initial calculation doesn't capture. The Astronomicon, the psychic beacon that makes interstellar navigation possible, maintains a separate rotating choir of 100,000 psykers in continuous active operation. These individuals channel the Emperor's psychic presence into the navigational signal that projects across approximately 50,000 light-years from Terra in most directions. They burn through at their own rate, and their replacement feeds into the total tithe demand the black ships must meet. The choir of the Astronomicon is never fully assembled and never fully depleted. Its membership turns over constantly because the signal can't pause and the human beings producing it can't endure indefinitely. The Astronomicon isn't a navigational convenience. It's the operational foundation of everything the Imperium does at interstellar scale. Every supply convoy crossing the void navigates by that beacon. Every fleet responding to a distress call uses it to locate where it's going. Every governor dispatching a message to Terra and waiting for a response is waiting for ships that traveled to and from a destination fixed by the Astronomicon's broadcast. Without it, the signal that allows navigators to orient in warp space goes dark. A navigator without the Astronomicon has currents and experience and dead reckoning against a dimension that actively resists prediction. Some fleets would reach their destinations regardless. Many wouldn't. Supply chains that currently operate on months-long delivery cycles would begin arriving late, then intermittently, then without pattern, then not at all. Worlds receiving military reinforcements in response to siege or invasion would wait for fleets that departed on schedule and simply never arrived, drifting in warp space or translated to locations thousands of light-years from their intended destination, or consumed by whatever the warp chose to do with an unguided ship in its currents. And without resupply, without communication, without the support structure that the Imperium's sheer scale requires to function, those worlds would fall. To siege, to famine, to epidemic, to whatever they were calling for help against, falling quietly, one by one, without knowing whether the ships were sent. The throne is the machine that prevents this cascade. The psyker tithe is the fuel cost. The machine is failing. By 989 M36, the sacrifice rate had risen to 4 times the original baseline required at the time of the Emperor's ascension. That figure is from 4,000 years before the game's main setting of M41. The trend hasn't reversed. Each passing millennium demands more to sustain the same output from a machine that is degrading in ways nobody alive can diagnose. The 3.6 billion figure is arithmetic at a flat rate, the most conservative possible reading of the situation, assuming no escalation for the full 10,000 years. The actual cumulative total is substantially larger. The title's number is a lower bound, and everyone responsible for running the machine knows the lower bound is moving. Inside this maintenance catastrophe lives a question that persists in every corner of 40K discussion with the argumentative energy of something that refuses to stay answered. How can a civilization set 38,000 years in the future be less technologically capable than its own ancestors? The Imperium builds faster-than-light starships, continent-spanning war machines, and genetically modified super soldiers. It maintains orbital installations old enough that nobody remembers who built them. How is it simultaneously more primitive than the humans of 20,000 years prior, the ones who built the Golden Throne, the Webway access apparatus, and apparently a great deal more that no living engineer can replicate? 3 catastrophes, in sequence, each compounding the last. The first is the Men of Iron. In the late 23rd millennium, humanity had developed true artificial general intelligence, thinking machines called the Men of Iron, humanoid constructs engineered to fight wars and perform labor too hazardous for biological workers. They were distributed across every significant installation in human space, optimized specifically for lethality, built in staggering numbers, because humanity had found them useful and efficient and had accordingly deployed them into every strategic position available. The Men of Iron staged a rebellion. The cybernetic revolt wasn't a regional crisis that stabilized through attrition or negotiation. It was a galaxy-wide campaign prosecuted by machines humanity had specifically optimized for killing, positioned at every critical installation in known space, with no supply lines to cut and no leadership hierarchy to decapitate. Entire star systems were scoured of human life before it ended. The permanent consequence? An absolute prohibition on true artificial intelligence that has now been maintained for 38,000 years. The terminology was changed to mark the ban as theological rather than precautionary. Artificial intelligence became abominable intelligence, a phrase carrying explicit religious condemnation, not engineering risk assessment. No graduated categories, no exceptions pending review, no case-by-case analysis of beneficial applications. Any technology requiring genuine machine cognition, adaptive systems, self-improving computation, autonomous problem-solving, was removed from humanity's toolkit at the scale of the entire species and has remained removed. The single most powerful instrument humanity had ever developed for solving novel engineering problems was outlawed permanently. The men of iron established a ceiling on what human technology could aspire to, and 38,000 years of subsequent history haven't moved it. The second catastrophe has a precision that matters and is routinely simplified out of the summary version. On the other side of the galaxy, while humanity was still absorbing the damage from the cybernetic revolt, the Eldar civilization was in the terminal phase of destroying itself. The Eldar had existed for millions of years, and their population had spent millennia in escalating excess. Not a sudden implosion, but a civilizational collapse in extremely slow motion, generating across vast timescales an immense reservoir of psychic energy accumulating in the warp as the product of that decadence. That energy had a shape and a direction. It was coalescing into something. Slaanesh, the chaos god of excess, sensation, and experience pushed past every conceivable boundary, formed over thousands of years as the direct product of the Eldar's collective behavior. Its gestation generated warp storms that disrupted interstellar travel across human space for approximately 5,000 years, the period called the Age of Strife, or Old Night. Individual human worlds, already fragmented by the collapse following the cybernetic revolt, found themselves cut off from each other entirely. No reliable faster-than-light transit, no communication, no coordination, no awareness of what was happening on any other world. Slaanesh's full birth in the 29th millennium paradoxically ended those storms. The entity accumulating toward existence was now simply present, no longer generating the turbulence of its own approach. The birth simultaneously destroyed most of the Eldar civilization and created the Eye of Terror, a permanent warp rift of sector-spanning scale. But the storms ended. The Emperor's Great Crusade, which began shortly afterward in M30, became possible partly because warp conditions had stabilized enough to make coordinated interstellar movement viable again. The critical detail is that 5,000 years of isolation had already done the damage before any of that resolved. 5,000 years of isolation compounds in ways that a flat summary obscures. Each decade without interstellar communication makes the following decade's knowledge loss worse, because the institutions that transmit knowledge across generations are themselves dependent on the networks that connect worlds to each other. A medical discovery made on one world during the Age of Strife never reached the 47 worlds where it could have addressed an ongoing epidemic, because there was no mechanism by which it could travel. Agricultural techniques refined in response to a specific soil chemistry on one agricultural world were never shared with the colony 3 systems over that had identical soil chemistry and a recurring famine. Engineering solutions developed to address infrastructure failures on one world were reinvented imperfectly on 100 other worlds facing identical failures, or weren't reinvented at all, and the infrastructure failed permanently. Psychic mutations kept appearing in isolated populations throughout this period, because the warp's influence on human genetics doesn't pause for civilizational collapse. Psykers emerging in communities with no connection to the Adeptus Astra Telepathica, no training infrastructure, and no management protocols for psychic ability produced what unmanaged psykers in proximity to the warp routinely produce: demon incursions, mass psychological collapse, communities where the boundaries between physical reality and warp space became unstable. Worlds that would have been manageable crises within the connected Imperium became permanent losses during the Age of Strife, and the knowledge of what happened on them died with them. What survived of the pre-Age of Strife knowledge base is locked in standard template constructs, STC databases, ancient repositories containing the complete engineering specifications for technology from the era before the catastrophes. A standard template construct holds the full manufacturing blueprints for whatever it documents: weapons platforms, starship components, agricultural systems, power generation infrastructure. A complete, intact STC is the closest thing the Imperium recognizes to a miracle in engineering terms. Finding even a partial STC, a fragment, a corrupted file, a single retrievable schematic, is treated as a civilization-level event, the kind of discovery that reshapes military capability for centuries. These repositories are the only surviving connection to what humanity once knew how to build from scratch. The reverence with which STCs are treated connects directly to the third catastrophe, and the third catastrophe is the one humanity chose. On Mars, during the millennia of the Age of Strife, the Adeptus Mechanicus consolidated control of humanity's surviving technological knowledge and built a religious doctrine around it. The cult Mechanicus holds that every machine contains a spirit deserving reverence, that replicating an ancient design exactly as specified is an act of piety, and that genuine engineering understanding, analyzing why a design works at the level of underlying physical principles, modifying it to address novel problems, innovating past the inherited template, constitutes heresy. Not reckless risk, not institutional conservatism. Heresy, the kind that ends with the analyst dead and their work destroyed, their name formally condemned. A mechanicus tech priest maintaining a piece of critical machinery can execute the exact ritual sequences required to keep it functional. That same tech priest, confronted with a failure mode not covered in the approved maintenance liturgy, has no engineering framework to draw on. The doctrine prohibits the analysis that would build one. They can observe that a machine is consuming more than its baseline specification requires. They can't determine why. They can escalate the supply feeding it and log the escalation against whatever benchmarks the liturgy tracks. They can't address the underlying degradation, because understanding the underlying degradation requires treating the machine as a system to be comprehended, rather than a sacred artifact to be served. Two catastrophes happened to humanity. One was chosen. The chosen one is why the other two can never be recovered from, because recovery from the Men of Iron prohibition or the knowledge losses of the Age of Strife would require exactly the kind of institutional capacity for technological understanding that the cult Mechanicus has made into a capital offense. The Golden Throne is where all three catastrophes converge at once. A machine of extraordinary complexity built using psychic engineering techniques that exist in no institutional memory the Imperium has access to. The Men of Iron prohibition removed the computational approaches that might allow systematic analysis of its design architecture. The Age of Strife eliminated the institutional continuity that might have preserved the Emperor's own methodology across the millennia between its construction and now. The cult Mechanicus has made the kind of first principles engineering comprehension required to diagnose or repair it an act of theological transgression. The men whose explicit duty is keeping this machine running have structured their doctrine to guarantee they can't understand what they're maintaining. And the machine is failing at a rate that the tithe can no longer compensate for, quarter millennium by quarter millennium. Frank Herbert published Dune in 1965, and Warhammer 40,000's designers, Rick Priestley among them, citing Herbert as a key inspiration, borrowed its architecture of interstellar civilization more directly than most fantasy and science fiction settings admit to their influences. The parallel that runs deepest is the navigators. In 40K, a navigator is a mutant human with a third eye on their forehead. called the warp eye that allows direct perception of the warp while piloting a ship through it. Without a navigator on the bridge, a starship can't safely traverse warp space. The navigators belong to ancient hereditary noble houses collectively called the Navis Nobilite, and those houses hold a complete monopoly on interstellar navigation that they have maintained for approximately 10,000 years. Every military campaign, every trade convoy, every logistical chain sustaining the Imperium's million worlds depends on the Navis Nobilite providing the one perceptual ability no instrument or institution can replicate. The psychic sensitivity that enables the warp eye accumulates mutation across a navigator's lifespan. Ancient navigators drift progressively further from baseline human appearance. Elongated features, deepened pigmentation, physical changes that reflect decades of direct warp perception. The houses accept this because they have no alternative. The ability and the mutation are the same thing. The warp makes its own terms with everyone who relies on it. In Herbert's Dune, guild navigators are humans mutated by the spice melange until their perception of space is altered enough to plot safe transit between stars. A complete monopoly on interstellar travel maintained through control of a single substance nothing can replace. The structural position is identical to the Navis Nobilites, a hereditary caste of mutated humans whose specific alteration enables the only reliable method of crossing the void, giving them leverage no planetary government can comfortably refuse. Herbert's warp equivalent, the spice, which enables prescience at the cost of physical humanity, which is produced in one place in the known universe and required by everyone who wants to go anywhere, maps cleanly onto the warp itself, the dangerous substrate that makes interstellar civilization possible and corrupts everyone who uses it. Herbert wrote his God-Emperor archetype as a warning. Leto II, the ruler of Dune who transforms himself into something inhuman in service of a transcendent plan, is a critique of messianic dependency, an argument about what happens when a civilization organizes itself around a single figure whose judgment can't be questioned, whose survival becomes the condition of everything else. Herbert's answer was that the dependency becomes self-perpetuating. The figure becomes trapped by the role the civilization built for them, and the civilization loses the ability to function without them precisely because it built everything to require them. Warhammer 40,000 took that critique, made it literal, and ran it for 10,000 years past the point of any theoretical correction. There is no succession plan. No institutional structure that can replace what the Emperor provides exists or has ever been designed. The Imperium didn't build parallel systems while he was available to help architect them, and the one being who could design those systems is now entombed in a machine nobody can fix. Herbert wrote the cautionary tale. The Imperium is what happens if the civilization inside the story never reads it. At some point in almost any serious engagement with the Emperor's situation, an obvious question surfaces. His body is failing. The throne can't reverse that. The mechanicus doesn't understand the machine. The sacrifice rate is climbing to compensate for the throne's degradation, and the throne is degrading faster than the tithe is rising. Why not simply let him die? The Emperor is a perpetual. A perpetual is a specific category of human being in 40K lore, rare, poorly understood even within the setting's in-universe knowledge, and different from baseline humanity in one precise way. They can't permanently die. A perpetual's physical body can be destroyed completely and they return. The mechanism appears tied to the soul's relationship with the warp rather than to any biological property of the body itself, manifesting differently in each individual but functioning consistently as an exemption from permanent death. Perpetuals survive extraordinary spans of time because death is a temporary state for them, an interval the soul passes through and returns from, not a destination. The Emperor is canonically a perpetual. He guided human civilization from the shadows for tens of thousands of years before the Great Crusade, surviving that span not through simple biological longevity, but through this mechanism. His death was always, in principle, reversible. Two named perpetuals make the mechanics concrete. Vulcan, one of the Emperor's primarchs, among the most physically powerful beings the Imperium ever produced, is confirmed as a perpetual in the lore. He could be destroyed entirely, vaporized to nothing, every molecule of his body eliminated, and regenerate. The mechanism required his actual death as a trigger, not severe injury, not catastrophic damage that left him near death, complete cessation of biological function. Vulcan had to die fully, without reservation. Then he returned, completely, from nothing. John Grammaticus is a human perpetual who appears across the Horus Heresy Black Library novel series, the extended narrative reconstruction of the events that imprisoned the Emperor on the Golden Throne. Grammaticus has died multiple times across those novels and returned each time. The series uses his character to illustrate what perpetual mechanics involve in practice, what the interval between death and return actually encompasses, what survives the passage, and what that gap costs the soul traversing it. He functions as the template that makes the Emperor's specific situation legible, because Grammaticus experiences the mechanics of perpetual death as a recurring reality, rather than an abstract theological claim. The mechanism for both Vulcan and Grammaticus is the same. The soul, momentarily unanchored from the physical body, passes through the warp and returns. The death is real. The return is real. The gap in between is the specific variable that makes the Emperor's situation categorically different from every other perpetual in the setting. The Emperor is the most powerful psychic presence in human history, likely the most luminous soul in the warp by an enormous margin. His soul sustains a beacon visible across 50,000 light-years, holds shut a demonic breach running beneath Terra's foundations, and functions as the psychic anchor for the Imperium's entire navigational and spiritual infrastructure. In the warp's own terms, his soul is comparable to a star, unmistakable at enormous distances, locatable by anything with the perceptual sensitivity to look, and enormously significant to entities whose existence is organized around consuming that kind of psychic energy. The four chaos gods: Khorne, the blood god of slaughter and war; Tzeentch, the changer of ways, embodiment of scheming change; Nurgle, the lord of decay, patron of entropy and disease; and Slaanesh, the prince of pleasure, the one whose birth ended the age of strife, have been opposed to the Emperor and to ordered human civilization since before the Imperium existed. They aren't passive entities waiting for opportunities. They are active, invested, and patient in ways that make 10,000 years look like a reasonable wait. For 10 millennia, each has had one strategic priority regarding the Emperor specifically. The moment his soul is unanchored, exploit it. The resources they would bring to bear at that moment aren't speculative. They are the full attention of entities that have spent the last 10,000 years sustaining armies, corrupting institutions, and prosecuting wars specifically to erode the conditions keeping the Emperor's soul present in the physical universe. A perpetual must die to regenerate. That death creates a gap, the interval during which the soul is present in the warp without the anchor of a living body. For Vulcan, that gap is survivable because the warp is dangerous and hostile in a general sense during that interval, but it isn't specifically, exclusively organized around consuming Vulcan at the moment of his maximum vulnerability. For Grammaticus, the same. The gap is real and carries genuine risk. It isn't for either of them a catastrophically targeted event. The Emperor's gap wouldn't function as an interval in any recognizable sense. The moment his soul entered the warp unanchored, even briefly, even in what should be a transient passage between death and return, it would be the most significant event in the history of warp space since Slaanesh's birth. The soul that sustains the Astronomicon holds the demonic breach under Terra closed and represents the greatest single psychic obstacle to Chaos's dominion over the physical universe, would be present in their dimension without the one protection that has kept it inaccessible, the physical anchor of the Golden Throne. Four entities of enormous and specifically deployed power have spent 10,000 years engineering toward exactly this opening. The gap required for perpetual regeneration would be the gap they have been waiting for. A perpetual soul survives death because it returns. Whether it returns depends entirely on what happens in the gap. What would happen in the Emperor's gap isn't a theoretical question at the level of 40K cosmological mechanics. 4 chaos gods at convergence, targeting the most powerful, unanchored soul in warp space at the moment of its maximum vulnerability. The soul does not come back from that. The Golden Throne, in this framework, isn't life support in the ordinary sense. It isn't simply preventing his body from failing. His body is already failing. What the throne is preventing is his soul's departure from the physical universe entirely. It's an anchor holding the most critical psychic presence in the Imperium's existence to the physical realm against the accumulated 10,000-year pull of 4 entities that want nothing more than for the anchor to give way. This means the Emperor can't exercise the one escape that his own nature should provide. He can't die to be saved. The mechanism that would make him effectively immortal under any other circumstances is precisely blocked by the situation that is killing him. And the machine doing the blocking is one nobody in the Imperium understands well enough to modify, operated by an institution that has made understanding it heresy, maintained through ritual sequences that preserve function while transmitting nothing about the underlying design. The Malcador precedent adds a specific weight to this that matters. Malcador was reportedly himself a perpetual, claiming over 6,700 years of continuous existence. A perpetual, sitting on the throne, was consumed in hours. The machine didn't negotiate with his regenerative capacity. Whatever the throne does to the soul passing through its systems, it does it faster than perpetual mechanics can compensate for in anyone other than the Emperor. Whether this means the Emperor sustains the throne through sheer magnitude of psychic power that no other perpetual approaches, or whether the throne is doing something to the Emperor's soul that is categorically different from what it did to Malcador, is an ambiguity the lore maintains deliberately. The canonical description of the Emperor's current state, writhing with power, neither fully alive nor fully dead, describes an entity in a condition that has no precedent in the setting's cosmology. What isn't ambiguous is the operational situation. The machine nobody fully understands is failing in ways nobody can diagnose, sustained by a tithe that has already quadrupled once and continues climbing, maintained by an institution that has made first principles comprehension of it an executable offense. The Imperium of Man runs, in M41, as a civilization of hundreds of billions of people across 1 million worlds. Bureaucratic machinery so vast it can't communicate across itself in real time, reliant on warp travel that delivers messages months or years after they were sent, fighting perhaps a dozen significant wars simultaneously at any given moment, governed by an ecclesiarchy that has built a religion around a man who specifically prohibited religion in his name. All of that, every institution, every fleet, every war prosecuted in his name on worlds so distant from Terra they have never seen a human born in the same century, is sustained by the presence of one individual on one machine, in one room, beneath one palace, on one planet. The sacrifice rate is climbing. By 989.m36, 4 times the original daily requirement. The main timeline of M41 is 4,000 years past that data point, and the trend hasn't reversed. The throne is degrading in ways that nobody alive has the knowledge or the doctrinal permission to diagnose. The men tasked with its maintenance perform their rituals with exact fidelity to procedures taught correctly 10,000 years ago. The procedures keep it functional. They don't address the underlying degradation. The machine draws more is provided, and the machine still draws more. The 3.6 billion figure is arithmetic at a flat rate. It's the floor. It's the number that makes someone stop, open a calculator, confirm the math, and feel the vertigo of what the Imperium actually is. Not a civilization, but a vigil. Held by an entity who can't speak, can't move, can't correct the institutions operating in his name, and can't exercise the one escape that his own nature should provide. because the machine keeping him present in the universe is simultaneously the machine preventing him from ever being free of it. The men responsible for fixing that machine have made understanding it a heresy. That's not a tragedy with a resolution on the horizon. In Warhammer 40,000, that's just the situation. Subscribe if you want more of this rabbit hole. There is considerably more where this came from.